Hello, Viking travelers. Welcome to this week on Viking TV and the topic being Scandinavia. My name is Knut Nesse. I'm your resident historian, and the lecture today is going to be History of Scandinavia. I'm talking to you from Montreal, Canada, but Norway is my home country. I'm a Norwegian, I grew up there, so I feel very close to this topic on Scandinavia. This lecture is going to take about 45 minutes and it'll be followed by a questions and answer session. So if you have a question, use the box on the right on your screen and send your question, and then Heather will join me later for the question and answer session. Today I'm going to talk about the history of Norway, Sweden and Denmark. And some of you may think that, well, Scandinavia, isn't that also Iceland and Finland? But in Scandinavia, we don't consider Finland and Iceland a part of the Scandinavian homeland. We consider Norway, Sweden and Denmark to be Scandinavia, and then we include Finland and Iceland in what we call the Nordic countries. And you know that Iceland and Finland have a very different language, and also Finnish people are a different ethnic culture to the Scandinavians. So there's much more similarities between Danes, Norwegians and Swedes. So that's what's going to be the topic of my talk today, the land of the Norse people. Let me get started with a timeline on the history of Scandinavia. I think that's very useful for us to sort of keep things together. Both Norway, Sweden and Denmark were united into one country around year 1000. Norway a little bit earlier, and then Sweden around year 1000. This was in the Viking period, the late Viking period. That's when the kingdoms of Norway, Sweden and Denmark were established. And another date to remember is when the Vikings came to North America. This is now dated to 1021. Also in the Middle Ages, there were some very important events that happened, one of them being the Black Plague. We'll touch on the Black Plague in the talk today. Another important event for Scandinavia was the Kalmar Union, a very interesting period in Scandinavian history. And that lasted until Sweden broke out of that union in 1523. We'll touch on that too. And that introduced a period where Sweden became a power, really a great power in the northern area. We'll talk about how this came to be and how it also ended. Denmark, Norway continued to stay together all the way up to the end of the Napoleonic era and only broke up in 1814. Norway thought it would be an opportunity to become an independent country, but the treaty dictated that Norway would become a part of Sweden, a union of Sweden, which lasted another 90 years or so. After the Second World War, we had the formation of NATO in 1849, important to Denmark and Norway because we were founding members. There was also a political movement called the Nordic Council, which brought the Nordic countries closer together. I'll touch upon that as well. And then we have the period with the European Union, Denmark joining in 1973. The Schengen Treaty, the Passport Union coming in 85. In 94, Norway joins kind of the European Union. We'll talk about that. And then Sweden joins finally in 1995. I've taken this timeline and put it in together with some other major world events so that you can see how these fit in with the history of Scandinavia. The Viking era is from 793 to around 1066. And we also have, during this time, the Holy Roman Empire. I'll talk about the Holy Roman Empire in my talk. The Vikings in North America in 1021, as I mentioned, and then the Norman conquest of England, 1066. That coincides with the end of the Viking era. That has been documented in the Bayeux Tapestry. Some of you may have seen the Bayeux Tapestry panels on the ship. The Black Plague again, and the Kalmar Union before the Hanseatic League, this trading organization that dominated trade in the Baltic Sea. I'll touch upon that too. The Reformation in 1517, also an important event for the Scandinavian countries. And here I've fit in the American Revolution, 1775, and also the defeat of Napoleon in 1815, just so that you see those dates here. American Civil War and Canadian Confederation, World War I, World War II, and then the formation of NATO, 1949, and the European Union established in 1957. So these are just some highlights on the timeline, so you know where we're going and how these things fit together. This is the overview of my talk today. I'll start about the early civilization and the Viking Age, move on to the Middle Ages and the Kalmar Union. Then I'll talk about Danish decline and Swedish Empire. And I'll finish up with modern times from about 1814. So let's get started on the first part. Here you see a map of Europe from around 12,000 BC. And what strikes you is, of course, the ice fields in the northern Europe, covering all of Scandinavia, a lot of the rest of northern Europe as well, and even a huge chunk of the British Isles. So from about 12,000 BC, this ice receded and the land became available for settlers. And these settlers who moved into the Scandinavian area came from northern Germany. So there were Germanic tribes that moved into this virgin territory. There was nobody there before these tribes came to Scandinavia. So the Scandinavians didn't displace anybody when they, settled in this area. I think that's an important thing to remember. And some of you may say, well, what about the Sami people? Well, the Sami people, first of all, came later, maybe around 1500 BC, and they came from a totally different place in Europe and Asia and moved into the north part of Scandinavia, going through Russia. And this is a different ethnic and linguistic group from the rest of Scandinavia. And the Scandinavians in the south and the Sami people in the north didn't really have much contact and didn't quarrel much over land in the early periods. I won't talk much about the Sami people in this presentation, but I just wanted to mention that, how they came to Scandinavia, and also acknowledge that they are part of Scandinavia, even though I'm mainly going to talk about the Scandinavians themselves. I love this map because if you look to the right, to the British Isles, you see that there is a land bridge there between Europe and the British Isles. So that was actually around 12,000 BC. There was actually possible to walk from Europe over to the British Isles. And as the ice melted, the water filled in, the English Channel and made England, Scotland, Ireland, islands. Vikings, we have to talk about the Vikings. This is a common history of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. They were all Vikings. The Vikings came from these three countries. It was their homeland. Now, this is a period in history that starts around 793 with the raid of the Lindisfarne Monastery, which is the first Viking raid that really is recorded in history. And it lasts for about 300 years, where the Vikings would come down to Europe and England and raid every summer. Can you imagine that? Every summer for 300 years, these fearsome Vikings would come and terrorize people in Europe. So it was a big menace. Now, the Vikings didn't call themselves Vikings, and neither did the people that were raided. They called them Norsemen or Northmen. The word Viking has come later in history by in the 20th century, when we found this name to call the people at that time. They had a word called to go a Viking. That meant to go on a raid in the summer and loot and bring that all back. So this is the name that has sort of stuck on the people of Scandinavia from that period. But as we shall see, they didn't really just go on raids. They also settled in many of the countries they went to. They settled in England, they settled in Ireland, they settled in France, and in Eastern Europe as well. So they really are not just raiders, but also pioneers and settlers. That's important to know about the Vikings. And also, they brought home Christianity from Europe. And at the end of the Viking period, you know, Scandinavia became Christian. A very big group of Vikings from Sweden settled in what's called the Russian Kiev area, a big Viking settlement focusing around the slave trade in the city of Kiev. So initially raiding, but then eventually trading slaves and other goods down the rivers of Eastern Europe. They also raided Constantinople, but eventually they made a deal with the emperor to be defenders of Constantinople. These were the Varangian Guards. You might have heard of them. They were mercenaries working for hundreds of years for the emperor of Constantinople, defending that city. A very important part of the Viking history. I said the Vikings raided for about 300 years, and it eventually ended. In 1066, we say that's the kind of the final year of the Viking era. It coincides with the invasion of conquest of England by William the Conqueror. Parallel to that conquest, there was another raid on England by a Norwegian king, Harald Hårråde, in the north of England at Stamford Bridge, where the last big Viking army was defeated by the English king. And we say that's the end of the Viking era. And the reasons the Vikings stopped raiding and, you know, became peaceful was partly Christianity that they had brought home to Scandinavia from the areas that they had settled and raided, but also that these nations of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden became kingdoms and were ruled by kings. That was also a very important part in why the Viking era ended. Let's move on to the Middle Ages and the Kalmar Union. Norway, after the Viking era and after a period of civil war, really came to its peak in the early Middle Ages. You see a map of Norway here to the left, that green area extending almost up into the Sami country in the north, huge chunk of Sweden, also Iceland and Greenland, which you don't see on this map. And then a lot of the islands, Shetland, the Hebrides, many of the islands on the west side of Scotland and England. This was Norway at its peak in the Middle Ages. It was a stable hereditary monarchy, and it was a very peaceful time after the Civil War period. So this is kind of when Norway was at its peak. You see on the right here also the map indicating how Sweden and Denmark looked at the time. Sweden, a different monarchy than Norway, they elected their kings. And they also had a huge chunk of Finland, as you see, plus the islands of Gotland, Åland, and also Denmark, which you see in brown here, had a big chunk of the south of Sweden, Skåne, and also a big chunk of Estonia, way back, way into the Baltic, as you can see. So that's how the Scandinavian countries looked at the time around 1300s. And as I mentioned here, the Swedes actually elected the Norwegian king Magnus to reign over them for a period of about 50 years. So at that point, Norway and Sweden was under one king. Now Denmark had a lot more trouble. There was a lot of civil war after the unification into one kingdom by Harald Bluetooth in 960. So Denmark had a lot of civil war, and the king eventually mortgaged a lot of the Danish country. You can see here how different parts of Denmark at this point in about 1330 was mortgaged away to German dukes. This meant that the German dukes could, have tax revenues and duties from these lands, and none of the money would go to the king. The king needed money to wage war, I guess, and therefore he pawned a lot of his land. And the last king before Valdemar, King Valdemar, was actually called the king without any land, since he had pawned away most of Denmark. And we came into a time when Denmark actually didn't have a king between 1330 and 1340. So it was a time when Denmark almost ceased to exist, actually. So it was a very precarious time for the Danish kingdom at that time. But then we have Valdemar, King Valdemar, who came around and became the Danish king in 1340 and turned things around. He got the nickname Atterdag, which means another day or a new dawn, because he kind of brought Denmark together, King Valdemar. Now below the Scandinavian countries was the Holy Roman Empire. And I know all of us, we know that name and we say, what was that? We kind of struggle to define the Holy Roman Empire. And I like to use Voltaire, who was quite a good philosopher, but he also characterized the Roman Empire by saying that, well, it is not holy, it is not Roman, and it's not even an empire. That's a pretty good definition, and I think it's pretty correct. It started with Charles I, the Frankish king, in 800, when he was crowned emperor by the Pope, and started this Roman Empire, kind of continuing this tradition of the Roman Empire into Northern Europe. And it lasted for as much as a thousand years. So it was a very long period of time that this Holy Roman Empire existed. But as you can see on the map here, it's just a conglomerate of different small states, principalities, kingdoms, all put together, and having an emperor on the top, but it was an elected emperor, and not everybody had the vote to elect him, only the electors, and there weren't that many of them. So it was a very weak empire. It didn't really have an army unless there was war and the emperor made one. So it was quite a strange little empire in the south, really, but it existed, as I said, for 1,000 years, and really, was very important in how the Scandinavian countries could become kingdoms and rule themselves at the time. Also, an important event at the time was the Black Death, which ravaged Scandinavia between 1347 and 51. You see here on the map how this plague started out in the Black Sea and then moved into southern Europe, and then eventually, year after year, moving further north to the Scandinavian countries. Now, the Black Death was really a bacteria that lived on ship rats, and when they had killed off the ship rats, they jumped over to humans, and they got infected lymph nodes. It was very, very painful, and the blood coagulated in your body, so that's why you turned black. It was called the Black Death. Very, very painful way to die, and very quickly, within 10 days you were dead for sure. And they believe as many as 75 to 200 million people in Europe actually died in the Black Death. So this was quite a dramatic time in Europe, devastating the population. And of course, with that comes trade, and everything kind of deteriorates with the Black Death. Now, one thing that emerges out of the Black Death is this thing called the Hanseatic League. I'm sure you've heard about it. It was really a trading alliance that started between the cities of Hamburg and Lübeck. You see the cities here on the map. Hamburg controlled the salt trade, and Lübeck controlled the herring trade in the Baltic. And of course, to preserve the fish, you needed the salt. So this alliance between these two cities was very, very important and lucrative. And from that developed this trading network. You know, the Hanseatic League it's not really a state. It's not really even a company, because it doesn't have a CEO, doesn't have a treasury, doesn't have a strict organization that we would expect. It's basically a very loose network of traders in various countries along the Baltics, from London all the way over to Novgorod, even up to Bergen, Norway. Very important, the stockfish trade there. And also cities into the mainland of Europe, down the rivers, maybe 200 cities altogether in the Hanseatic League. And their goal was to monopolize trade, to control trade, and to make sure they got the best prices and the best access to the resources. So they got monopolies given to them by the kings and rulers in these areas, and became a very dominating and politically important force in the Baltic area, certainly for Scandinavia. The Hanseatic League lasted for about 400 years, so it was quite a long time that the Hanseatic League was active. Now, I'd like to talk about a time in history when the three Scandinavian countries came together as one, under one regent, under one queen, actually. And this is called the Treaty of Kalmar. And the person who really got this treaty going is Margaret. She was the daughter of Valdemar of Denmark that I talked about earlier. Very early on, she was married to the Norwegian King Håkon, moved to Oslo. They had a son, Olav. And when her father, the Danish king, died, Olav became the king of Denmark, but he was only 5 years old. So she became the regent. So she was the ruler of Denmark quite suddenly. And then eventually her husband Håkon died too, the king of Norway, and her son was still underage. So she also became the regent of Norway. So, you know, she goes from queen and to be regent of two countries in Scandinavia within a very short period of time. And then what happened was that Olav, her son, died, and both Norway and Denmark allowed her to continue as the regent. And she had the ambition that Scandinavia should be one unit. So she went to the Swedes and negotiated to become their regent as well. As you may remember, I said the Swedes elected their kings. So she was elected the regent of Sweden, and thereby she created this Kalmar Union, where she was basically the ruler of the Scandinavian countries, a woman, you know, obviously with an idea that these countries should be together. It lasted for all of 125 years, so that was quite a long time, and you know, quite an achievement for a young woman. And a very important woman in the history of Scandinavia. But the Danes had more or less control of the Kalmar Union, and the Swedes didn't like that very much. Sweden was sort of emerging now as a more strong nation, and wanted to break apart from Denmark and Norway. They felt that Denmark was controlling everything. So there was this movement started by Gustav Vasa to make Sweden independent. And parallel to that was the rule of Christian II, the Danish king, who was quite a brutal ruler, was called the tyrant, really. He instigated a bloodbath in Stockholm in 1522, and this really upset the Swedes. So Gustav Vasa was able to unify the Swedes and break away from this Kalmar Union in 1523. Norway still stayed a part of Denmark under Danish rule, basically, but Sweden now became very soon the more dominating country in Scandinavia. Another thing that happened around 1530 was that the Reformation came to Scandinavia. Martin Luther had started the Reformation in 1517, and it spread really like wildfire. This was the opposition to the Catholic Church, to all the practices that were seen as unethical, and the dominance and, let's say, the abuse of power that people perceived the Catholic Church to exert at the time. So Luther's teachings were very quickly catching on in Scandinavia, and the Reformation was introduced mainly by the kings. We see here Christian III of Denmark, who brought the Reformation to Denmark, also brought it to Norway. In Norway, there was some opposition to the Reformation, mainly by the last Catholic Archbishop, Olav Engelbrektsson. He saw actually an opportunity here to break away from Denmark. So he was opposed to the Reformation, and really with the objective to make Norway an independent country at the time. Now, he wasn't successful. He was deposed and exiled, and the Reformation came to Norway as well. Sweden also, through Gustav Vasa, turned to Protestantism. There were also some wars, needed to make that happen. Sweden took quite a long time to become thoroughly Protestant. Not even until 1590 was Sweden thoroughly, in the Reformation. And the Catholic Church often thought that Sweden was one of those countries that they could take back in the counter-Reformation that the Catholic Church initiated after the Reformation. They tried to get Sweden back into the Catholic fold, but it didn't work. So by 1590, Sweden was totally reformed to Protestantism. And this starts a period when the king of the various Scandinavian countries is head of the church. So you have this Lutheran church becoming the state church of all these three countries, with the king at the top. And this lasts way until into the 20th century. It's only the last 20, 30 years that really the state church concept has been abolished in Scandinavia. Let's move on to Danish decline and Swedish Empire. Now, Denmark around 1600, 1620, 30s was doing quite well, thank you. I talked about the king without land and Denmark being pawned away to the German dukes. Now things were totally different in Denmark. And this was very much due to its strategic position. You see here the map that it has a huge chunk of the southern part of Sweden called Skåne. And that also makes it control the ship passage from the Baltic into the North Sea. All the ships have to pass through that little channel between Skåne and Sjælland you see on the map, and that's an opportunity for Denmark to tax the trade and the ships passing through. So this is quite good for Denmark and makes Denmark quite prosperous. There's also wars going on in the south, in Europe, south of Denmark, and Denmark is kind of profiting a lot from not being part of those wars. So up until 1645, Denmark is doing quite well. And the King Christian the Fourth of Denmark, Norway, he's seen as one of the kings who really build a lot of new palaces, both in Norway and in Denmark. And he's left a lot of architectural legacies behind. But this all ends around 1645, because now Sweden has become quite strong. You know, remember, it's double the population. It's also area-wise quite much larger than Denmark, and a lot of natural resources, both metals, wood. So Sweden emerges now as one of the more prosperous and rich nations, and they, you know, try to take control over those areas in the south of Sweden that now are held by Denmark. So Denmark, you know, sees a lot of aggression from Sweden in this period, as we shall see. Now, the big start of Swedish dominance comes with this king called Gustav Adolf. He's kind of the king that changes the way Sweden is going and starts to make Sweden into a big power in the Baltic area, certainly in Scandinavia, but also in the Baltic area. He's a very good administrator. He organizes Sweden in a much more efficient way. He's a great military leader, probably one of the best military leaders that Sweden has had, certainly very, very recognized as one of the best at the time. And there's a lot of wars going on. There is the war, 30 Years' War from 1618 to 48, which is quite a devastating war in Europe. It's really a war of religion between Catholics and Protestants. And Sweden joins that war on the Protestant side, as it is now, you know, a reformed country. And Gustav Adolf is really the one who leads that war and is very successful for Sweden in that 30 Years' War. Very, very highly recognized as a competent administrator and a military leader. One thing that we associate with Gustav Adolf is the ship you see on the right here. It's called the Vasa ship. And if you go to Stockholm, if you've been there, I'm sure you've been to see the Vasa ship, which is on display in the museum. It's the biggest attraction in Stockholm, actually. So if you haven't seen it yet, you should definitely go there when you are in Stockholm. It's one of the ships that he had made, the grandest ship at the time, but it had a flaw in construction. It was very top heavy. So as it was launched in 1628, it capsized in the bay, Stockholm Bay, and, you know, sank. So it's a big disaster, of course, but, you know, the fully new intact ship basically landed at the bottom of Stockholm Bay and sat there for, you know, hundreds of years until they realized that it was there covered in mud. And when they removed the mud, the ship was practically intact. So that's why you can see this ship so intact in the museum in Stockholm. It's really a grand thing to go and see how this beautiful ship is recreated. The authentic ship is taken out of the water and put in the museum. So please go see that, don't miss that. Now, the thing was, Gustav Adolf dies in the 30-Year War. In 1632, he dies. He's a great commander, but he dies at the Battle of Lützen. And that leaves really a vacuum in Sweden when it comes to who's going to take over, because he has no sons, he only has a daughter. And this is Christina. She's only 5 years old when he dies. And I like Christina. Christina is a really interesting character, interesting personality. When she was born, they brought out the baby and say, "Oh, it's a boy, it's a boy." But it wasn't a boy. She was a girl. They thought they had a boy for, you know, a day or two, but then, you know, she turned out to be a girl. She had very masculine features, and all through her life, she kind of lived more like a boy than a girl. Never married, you know, felt, I guess, that she was different. But she became queen at 5 years old, and was, of course, underage and had regents. But, at around 1618, she takes over and becomes the regent of Sweden. And she has a different take on how to run a country. She doesn't want to get involved in wars anymore. She wants the wars to end. She's much more interested in arts and science. She's an intellectual. You see here she has discussions with the French philosopher Descartes. And so she changes the court in Sweden and promises really to be a very, very different regent at the time when Sweden is really emerging as a superpower in the north. But then, very surprisingly, she abdicates at the age of 28. She has her nephew made king, and she gets a stipend and moves around in Europe, living as a queen without a realm. And also, surprisingly, she converts to Catholicism. Sweden is a Protestant country. They participated in the 30-Year War as a Protestant country, and she was raised as a Protestant. And then after abdication, she converts to Catholicism and becomes very close to the Pope, has very close contacts, lives in Rome for a large part of her life, is actually buried in the Vatican, if you can believe it. A very interesting person. There's lots of books written about Christina. So, if you really want to study another great woman in the Scandinavian history, Christina is one that you should take a look at. So Sweden is now getting to be the big power in Scandinavia. It has to do with their resources, the population, also the efficiency of their military and how they recruit and maintain a big military. This in Sweden is called Stormaktstiden, the era of great reign. And it's a period of maybe 100 years from 1611 up until 1721. Started really by Gustav Adolf and then continued by the other Swedish kings. And what we now see is an expansion of Swedish territory into Baltic, certainly. Huge chunks of Finland, even chunks into Russia are taken. You see the map here on the left. All the area around the Baltic, the Bay of Finland there, where present-day St. Petersburg is, a lot of Estonia, all of what Denmark had in South Sweden is taken back, huge chunks of Norway as well. And Sweden now in this period continues to exert its power and become a real power in the Baltic area, eventually moving into Europe, starting to be aggressively acquiring lands in Europe as well. Now, one of the big warring kings of Sweden is this guy here, Charles XII. He became king at the age of 19 in 1700, and he starts and continues this expansion of the Swedish Empire. He's so busy with warring that he hardly spends any time in Sweden. He never gets married, and he has this very close contact with his soldiers. So he's really become a hero and has been, really seen as one of the big Swedish war heroes. One of his big battles is against the Tsar Peter the Great of Russia in 1700. Here on the right, the Battle of Narva, where he defeats the Russian army. He eventually is defeated, though, in the Battle of Poltava in present-day Ukraine in 1709. You see an image of that battle here on the right. And the big new power now in the Baltic is, of course, Russia, with Peter the Great, who comes to power just before this great Northern War is started, and eventually wins this Northern War in 1721. He expands the Russian Empire, creates the city of St. Petersburg, and that's a huge part of Russian history, as you may remember. The guy on the left here, a Norwegian who was also quite a hero in in these wars, though he was, you know, fighting for the Danes, the Norwegian and the Danes. He's called Tordenskjold. He's quite a character, also one who lives a very short life, eventually dies in the duel, but remains, becomes a hero in naval history because of one of his major battles against the Swedes in this period. Let's move on to 1814 and into modern times. I said Norway remained a part of Denmark even after the Kalmar Union, and was really a colony of Denmark in this period, almost 400 years until 1814, when things will change. Denmark sides with Napoleon in the Napoleonic Wars that raged from around 1800 to 1814. And of course, Napoleon is defeated. That means also that Denmark is defeated on the losing side, and they have to give up Norway. So this is when Norway-Denmark breaks apart. But Norway thinks this is an opportunity to become an independent country. So we have a constitutional assembly made in Norway on May 17, 1814. The constitution is declared. We even bring a prince from Denmark to become the new king of Norway. But the problem is that this peace treaty after the Napoleonic War dictates that Sweden is supposed to take Norway. So King Karl Johan, the King of Sweden, declares that Norway is in the union with Sweden and becomes also King of Norway. It's actually two kingdoms now, but ruled by the same king, King Karl Johan. King Karl Johan, strangely enough, was really a marshal in Napoleon's army. And he was very successful. He rose from, nothing through the ranks and became a marshal, one of the most important military leaders under Napoleon. But then towards the end of the war, he flips side, and he's asked by Sweden to become the crown prince because the king of Sweden has no heir. So he becomes the crown prince of Sweden and eventually king of Sweden. And when Sweden ends up on the winning side in these wars, he sees the opportunity to take Norway and become king of Norway as well. And that union lasts until 1905, actually. So after this long period with Denmark, Norway is now under Sweden for another 90 or so years. 1848 is when revolutions start to happen in Europe. All over Europe, there are all kinds of revolts, rebellions of workers and people living in poverty against the regime. We've seen this partly immortalized through plays like Les Miserables, musical Les Miserables, an uprising from the 1830s in Paris. All over Europe in 1848, there are revolutions of the same kind, the students and workers revolting against the regime. And this also flows into Scandinavia. In Sweden, there is a march unrest in 1848, and similar change of the political scenery in Norway and Denmark as well. The Danish Folketing, the parliament, is established in 1849 as a consequence of this. And in Norway, the first labor leader comes forward. He's Marcus Trane, one of the first Scandinavian labor leaders, starts his work around this time. And eventually the parliamentary system is established both in Norway, Sweden and Denmark, and the labor movement gains more and more influence. The kings have to cede power, and the parliaments take over and rule in constitutional democracies eventually in Norway, Sweden and Denmark. There's also this trend at the end of the 1800s called Scandinavism, and it's more of a cultural trend, really. It's political, but very strongly cultural. students were really proponents of this idea that Scandinavia belongs together. A little bit the idea of Margaret that we saw earlier in the Kalmar Union. These countries are so similar, they have a similar language, similar history, and similar ethnic composition, and we sort of belong together as one. We'll be stronger as one. So this movement gains force in the late 1800s. You can see some of these posters from the time, and also students gathering. One man, important man, who really was a supporter of this movement was Hans Christian Andersen. He wrote famously a poem called "I'm a Scandinavian, jeg en Skandinav," which was kind of a cry to this movement to come together and for Scandinavianism to really flourish. So he was a very important supporter of this movement. This movement didn't really go anywhere. It didn't get the political roots that it needed. So it became, eventually just a fad, a good idea, but didn't change things from the way they were. I'm going to move over now to the World Wars and say a little bit about how Scandinavia was, what happened there in the World Wars. World War I was all the Scandinavian countries were neutral. They tried to stay neutral and managed to do that more or less all through the First World War. In the Second World War, it wasn't that easy because Norway was very strategic and Denmark was so close to Germany. So very quickly, early on in 1940, Denmark and then eventually Norway were both occupied by Nazi Germany and remained occupied all through the war. This was a time when, was a very time of very, bad oppression in Denmark and Norway, and also when the opposition movements started, and there's a lot of heroic stories in Denmark and Norway of people fighting the German occupation. For Sweden, it was a different story. They remained neutral, and they managed to remain neutral all through the war, albeit with, making some important concessions like shipping iron ore to Germany, letting German troops travel through Sweden to get to northern Norway and so on. So things like we as Norwegians don't really care that much about, but it let Sweden stay neutral. I guess Hitler decided that it would be too much drain on the German army to take Sweden, and if they remained neutral and cooperative, that was probably the best he could achieve. But after the war, there are some more ideas about Nordic Union that are coming forward. We know that Denmark and Norway joins NATO, so kind of the military alliance is secured for these two countries. But then for the Nordic area itself, including Finland and Iceland, there's an idea that these countries have to work together. There's ambition that this will become an economic union and that they will sort of eventually be an economic force in the north of Europe. When the Nordic Council was established in 1952, it was much more pared down set of ambitions. There was a lot of economic cooperation. There was also a no border, no passport. There was a passport union. So a lot of close cooperation, but not really a big shift in the way these countries were run politically as independent countries. And the competing idea at the time was, of course, the EU, and eventually EU becomes more important and more dominant, and of course this takes away the idea of having a Nordic area of close political and economic cooperation. So eventually Denmark joins the EU, Sweden joins the EU, and Norway doesn't really join the EU, but becomes very close to the EU through economic cooperation, trade, basically free trade, in all areas except agriculture, fish, and also that Norway is allowed to control its own natural resources like oil and gas. I think those have been the important things for Norway to keep control of, and that's the reason why Norway hasn't joined the European Union at this point. But we are very close. We're inside Schengen. We have inside the passport union. We accept all the laws that are passed in the EU. So we are very close. We're just not there in the parliament deciding on the laws of Europe. So that brings me to the summary of my talk today. We talked about the Vikings, who were traders and settlers in addition to their raids. We moved on to talk about Margaret's idea of a union of Scandinavia, which was realized in 1397 and lasted for more than 100 years. We also moved on to the Reformation that really changed all of Scandinavia from a Catholic country to Protestant area in the 1530s. Then we hear about the Swedish dominance and how Sweden as a power emerges in the 1600s and become the dominant power around the Baltic Sea. The Swedish Empire rising as it takes over a lot of areas in Russia, in Finland, north of Europe around the Baltic, up until 1721. And then we have 1814, an important year for Norway as well, because we break away from Denmark, but become a part of Sweden, in the union with Sweden for another 90 years. And the final World War II period, both Denmark and Norway occupied. 52 Nordic Council established, but then eventually the European Union membership becomes the dominant political and economic association for the Scandinavian countries. So that ends my talk on the history of Scandinavia. We will now have the question and answer session. There is a little box to the right on your screen where you can write some questions and send them in. And Heather will now join us to present some of those questions, and I hope I can answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Knut. Right, our first question tonight is from Paul in the United States, and he asks, he would love to hear more about Finland's role during the period covered in this programme, including going back to the Viking era. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I can give you some highlights. The Finns were not Vikings. So the Vikings came from Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. The Finns have a different origin than the Scandinavians, as you probably know. They migrated up to Finland from Eastern Europe, have a different language. In the Middle Ages, Sweden dominated most of the coast of Finland, certainly in the Baltic and the Bay of Bosnia, and also down the coast. The Finns were not a very, what should I say, active on the Scandinavian or European scene at the time. They were, I guess, farmers and settlers, and were kind of under the Swedish dominance. And this lasted quite a while, actually. Russia gets control of the Baltic around 1709, 1720, more or less, and controls then the Bay of Finland. Sweden still controls a lot of Finland, but loses Finland to Russia at around 1809, and Finland is made a part of Russia under Tsar Alexander. And if you go to Helsinki on the square, main square there, you see there's a statue of Alexander. The Finns basically have a lot of admiration for him. He gave them a lot of freedom, and I think they really appreciate that time in history. quite a much. And Finland eventually gained independence during the Russian Revolution in 1917. So that's when the Finnish state is established. It's just about 100 years old, really. So those are the highlights of Finland for you.
Thank you. That's brilliant. Question here from Brooke in the Villages in the United States, and she says, can you tell us anything about who came before the Vikings, or do historians think of the Vikings as being the very first Scandinavians?
Yes, they were, let's say, the first Scandinavians. As I was explaining, when the ice receded, new land was revealed in Denmark and Sweden and Norway, and Germanic tribes moved there and settled there and lived there during the Stone Age, a later Stone Age than what had taken place in the European continent. But still, these are the peoples, and they lived along the coast where they traveled. They created their efficient ships, the long ships that were very important for them traveling along the coast. Coastal, trade and travel was the important thing. And when they had this very good ship, the Viking longship, that could really cross the Atlantic and not break apart because of its special construction, they had this opportunity really to sail across and actually do raids. Now, why they really started doing the raids, we don't know, but we think maybe there was overpopulation. There might have been, less land available. There was civil wars in Scandinavia, so this could have triggered the Vikings to start raiding. But the tool that they had was the ship that allowed them to travel so far. The ship, can just beach right on shore. It's very easy to move in and out. It can be portaged. It can carry a lot of goods. So they had the tool they needed to do these raids. But yeah, there were nobody there before them. These were the old Germanic tribes that eventually became the Northmen or Norsemen that we today call the Vikings.
Thank you. Question here from Rachel in Chicago, and she says, can you comment at all on any interactions that we know of between the Sami people and the Vikings? Were they very distinct groups?
Thank you. That's interesting. Yes, they were quite distinct groups. They had a very distinct language, so they didn't have a common language. They were also ethnically distinct. The Sami people coming from Eastern Europe, and also their way of life was very distinct. The Sami people very much rain herders and living in the inland. The Vikings typically the Norse people living typically on the coastline, farming and fishing, whereas the Sami people were more a nomadic life. And the Vikings didn't really go that far north. Lofoten is kind of the most northern point of the Viking settlements, I think, that we know about. But they did go further north on occasion to trade. They called the Sami people Finns. I don't know where that word really comes from, but that's kind of the Viking word for these people. And they were peaceful with them. That's my take on it. And traded, and there was not really big disputes over land and so on. It's more in the more recent history when we come to want to convert them to Christianity, or we want them to go into school systems, or we believe that their way of life is it's not as civilized as ours. That's, in the 1800s, 1900s, that's when sort of the conflict with the Sami people arises. It wasn't during the Viking era.
Thank you. Jennifer in the United States asks, could you also talk a little bit about Iceland's history and independence?
Yes. Yes, Iceland was, sort of discovered by the Vikings. There were nobody there when the Vikings, or when the Norwegians really came around 800, 870 is when Iceland is settled, and mostly by Norwegians. Most of the Icelanders are of Norwegian heritage. Sometimes they brought women slaves with them and married slaves, so many of the women were not of Norwegian heritage, but mainly the Icelanders are of Norwegian heritage, and they fled often because they were outlawed in Norway, or they didn't have any land. They didn't want to live under the king, so they went kind of to seek land and freedom in Iceland, and that's why in Iceland you have this very special parliament, ting, developed among the settlers there, and this long period in Iceland where they are ruled by democracy, by deciding annually at the ting how to sort things out and make laws and things like that. So that's how Iceland was established by the Norwegian settlers. Eventually, Iceland, under around 1200, after civil war in Iceland, became a part of the Kingdom of Norway, and with that also Greenland became a part of the Kingdom of Norway. So that's when the Norwegian period in Iceland starts. And eventually, when Norway becomes a part of Denmark, then Iceland is a part of Denmark. And after the Napoleonic Wars, when Norway breaks away from Denmark, Iceland and Greenland stays in the Danish kingdom. And it's only after the war, Second World War, that Iceland really regains its independence. So that's briefly Icelandic history.
Fantastic, thank you. We've got Bill in Windsor in Canada, and he asks, were the Norsemen a somewhat unified culture, or were there factions who were at war amongst themselves?
There were certainly many factions, and there were varying allegiances between the various tribes. A lot of fighting, infighting, definitely. I mean, you've seen the Viking series on TV. A lot of that, of course, is creation, but there is a lot of strife and conflict between various warlords and so on, up until the time when the kings are established, the kingdoms are established in Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. That comes in the late 9th century up until year 1000. Then the kings start to have more dominant control of the various countries. So yes, there was, unity. I mean, there's unity of culture and language and things like that, but there's always various warlords fighting for control and so on.
Thank you. And we have Dorian, who's in Ontario, Canada as well. And they say, how did Sweden and Norway and Denmark come to be separate countries following the end of the Viking era? Was it different tribes and rulers within the Viking people who set their land boundaries?
Yes, the country that started first to become a separate nation was Norway in the year about 870, or we have Harald Fine here who kind of unites Norway, and basically we're talking about the south part of Norway, the west part of Norway, and it really conquers it and takes over control, and that becomes sort of the first kingdom being established. Of course, a lot of conflicts still going on. He doesn't have a control of the whole country. A lot of other earls still in opposition. Then you have Denmark, which also is united under Harald Bluetooth in around 960. The same thing happening here, warring lords, and then eventually Harald Bluetooth takes control and claims to have united Denmark. He also brings Christianity to Denmark. So that's really how Denmark becomes one kingdom. And then you have Sweden, which is a little different because there, as I mentioned, you have elected, they elect their kings. They're really two parts of Sweden, Svealand in south and Götaland in kind of around Stockholm and that area, that chunk of land. These are two different parts of Sweden that eventually come together and become one kingdom, and elect their king. Sometimes the king is from Norway, sometimes the king, and they can unelect the king too, which is quite interesting. So Sweden kind of emerges as a different type of kingdom, but still that's how these three kingdoms kind of emerge after the Viking period.
Thank you. Now we have Sherry in Denver, and she asks, during the period of the Black Death, how did the rats get onto the ships?
Yes, the ships, these rats were a kind of rat that sometimes called ship rat, or they kind of often live on ships, but they get on the ship with the grain. They follow the food basically. So when you load on grain, you can have rats in it. Also, rats can climb up the gangplank, and they can climb on ropes and stuff. I don't know if you've been on Viking, and you see some places when they put the ship, ties the ship up to shore, they put these little funnels on the ropes. Have you seen that? That's to prevent rodents from coming on board the ship. It's a problem today too, of course, not as bad as it was then, but it's something you don't want on the ship. So that's how they got on the ship, basically off from land, but sneaking on board, following the food.
Thank you. Now we have Damien in Orlando, and he says, what happened to end the Hanseatic League, and does a legacy from these trading links still exist today?
Good question. Yes, absolutely. The legacy exists today. If you've been in Bergen, you see the Hanseatic trading posts still there, a very important part of the Bergen, downtown scenery. Gdansk, Poland, very important Hanseatic city. Lübeck. And Hamburg too, very important Hanseatic. So the legacy is still there. This trade that was started by the Hanseatic League certainly has continued in various forms. The downfall of the Hanseatic League was that the kingdoms that emerged didn't want the Hanseatic League to have monopoly, because that meant that they couldn't be taxed. And that was a lot of important income for Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. The king needed to tax trade so that he could have income. And when the Hanseatic League had a monopoly, he couldn't do that. So that's why they wanted the monopoly gone. That's one of the reasons for downfall of the Hanseatic League. Another thing is that the Hanseatics basically was a barter trade, and so there was no money changing hand. There was just trading goods for goods, and if you needed credit, the Hanseatics would give you credit, so you would tie them together in that way. And then the Italians invented banking, and so you didn't need credit from the Hanseatic League. You can get credit from somebody else, and also money was created. So now you didn't need to barter anymore. So all this, let's call it the business model of the Hanseatic League, kind of collapsed. And then finally you have the Reformation, because a lot of the trade was fish, and Europe after the Reformation didn't eat that much fish, because before they had the Catholic Church said you had to eat fish on Fridays, and now with the Protestants they say you can eat meat on Fridays. So that's also said to be one of the reasons why the Hanseatic League collapsed eventually.
Thank you. We have a specific question here from Miki, one of our regular viewers. So she says, with the Hanseatic League, she noticed that the Norwegians had special paintings which you can see on the back of the stools, on the bar stools on the Viking ocean ships. She's seen the same paintings in a town called Friesland in the Netherlands, which was a member of the Hanseatic League. And then she found them on a small wooden container in Geiranger in Norway. And on the box it says, bunadsölv. Do you have any idea what that might mean?
Bunadsölv is really, bunad is the national costume of Norway, and sölv is silver. So bunadsölv means the silver jewelry that you wear on your bunad. So that's what that specifically means. But I guess the Hanseatic League left a lot of their emblems. You know, they were very important for them was these symbols. You know, the pennants that they used on the ships to signal who they were and what alliances they had, and all these symbols and arms that they used. I mean, arms like coat of arms. Was the symbol that they belonged to this alliance. It was a very loose alliance, and you had to have these identifiers, I guess, to kind of show your color. So say, yes, I'm one of you guys. You know, it wasn't an organization with membership. It was everybody was really on their own, but cooperating because it was profitable. So I think that's what I have to say to that comment.
Thank you, Knut. A question here from Brian in Maryville, Indiana, and he says, do you know how the Vasa ship survived to be recovered in such good condition after hundreds of years under the sea?
Yes, they say that it was really covered in mud so that it didn't deteriorate. You know, it's the same thing with Viking ships. Most Viking ships are gone because they just sink and then they deteriorate and the wood goes away. But some of the ships in Viking graves, like the Oseberg ship, was really buried in clay. So the clay basically insulates the ship from oxygen and sort of makes a capsule around the ship in a way. And that's the same thing that happened to the Vasa ship. All the silt and the mud and the clay in the bay in Stockholm basically covered the ship and preserved it. That's why in the Vasa Museum, it's a very specific climate that they try to maintain for the ship to be preserved.
Thank you, Knut. Question here from Katie in Cambridge, and she says, was there an industrial revolution in Scandinavia, similar to that which occurred in the UK during the 19th century? And if so, what were the main industries during this time?
Yes, there was definitely. I didn't talk very much about that, but the most resourceful countries, the country with the most resources in Scandinavia is Sweden, which has a lot of mines, minerals, and of course a lot of the iron industry, and also the lumber industry is really very, you know, originates very much in Sweden. So I guess that was where the Industrial Revolution kind of started out. But also in Denmark and Norway, we have an Industrial Revolution. And I think it's the same that we see in other countries. It's cloth making, it's various foundries of sort, and you see the migration, which is characterized by this revolution of people from the land, from the rural areas to the cities. You have this overpopulation of the cities, and then you have the squalid conditions of the workers, and then you have the labor movements emerging from that. And so this is a very much part of the political history too of the Scandinavian countries, how they see these labor movements having been born out of this industrialization, and then eventually, as you know today, the social democratic system is very strong in Scandinavia, and both Norway, Sweden, and Denmark have that, and the Social Democrats have been really one of the parties in power for several decades, you know, many decades in all three countries, you know, from the 1930s, certainly, up until today.
Thank you. Kevin in Canfield in the United States says, do you know the reasons why the ideas of Scandinavism didn't take hold? Was there a lot of opposition to this idea?
I don't really know why it didn't take hold. There was a lot of nationalism at the same time, certainly in Norway in the late 1800s, which was really ideas that Norway should be its own country with its own culture. We have many poets, and Henrik Ibsen and that period were certainly proponents of these ideas. Remember that Norway was still in a union with Sweden in the late 1800s. So we were not really a totally independent country at the time. So I can imagine that this idea of Scandinavism was kind of, kind of countered with this nationalist ideas that we had at the same time, that people felt like, no, Norway needs to be its own country. We have now been too long in part of Denmark and now part of Sweden. We need to have our own flag. We need to have our own, parliament, our own king, all that. So I think that kind of was part of the why Scandinavism didn't really flourish so much. But there could be other reasons too that I'm not so aware of.
Thank you. Question here from Ken in Lancaster in the United States, and he says, how did the 1905 separation of Norway from Sweden come about?
This is a very interesting question, and it's certainly something that all school children in Norway learn very early on in school, because it was really a weakening of the king's position in Norway in being able to really exert power and have government and have an efficient government in Norway. See, at the time, Norway had its own parliament, and Sweden had its own parliament, and then the king had kind of his prime minister who was running the country, but there were a lot of issues that sort of came about that were not conducive to keeping that union. The parliament in Norway was very much opposed to it. It came to a peak in 1905 when the parliament simply decided, in the session, saying that the union between Norway and Sweden ceases to exist because the king cannot, create an efficient government. So this is kind of a very, one-sided declaration, and they didn't really know what would happen after that, whether they would, Sweden would go to war with Norway, or the king would go to war with Norway, or disband the parliament or something. But basically the king kind of accepted that. I guess he had realized that he didn't really have an efficient government of Norway. So, so the union was over.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
We have some questions now about ancestry. So Margaret in the United States would like to know, is there any traces of Viking and Scandinavian DNA in present-day Ireland? And Joy in the United States says her mother is British and her father is Irish, and both families go back a long way. But she has found that she has 6% Norwegian DNA. Can you explain a little bit how that might have come about?
Oh, yes. I mean, Ireland, Scotland, England, all the islands, Hebrides, there were a lot of Viking settlements there. I mean, they didn't just raid, they settled. Dublin was created by the Vikings. There was a Viking settlement in around York. I mean, so a lot of Scandinavians really moved over to the British Isles and settled there. And that is, of course, an explanation why many have, Scandinavian ancestry, even though they are from Ireland or Scotland or England. So it makes a lot of sense, that there is a blend of Scandinavian blood in the genes of people in Ireland.
Thank you. Question here from Steve. He's in Moorhead in the United States, and he says, Do you believe that the Kensington runestone is authentic? It's evidence that Swedes and Norwegians travelled via Hudson Bay, Lake Winnipeg and the Red River of the North into modern-day Minnesota around the 14th century.
Yes, that's. I've had that question many times on Viking ships, typically after my presentation on the Vikings. I guess, I don't believe that this is an authentic rune stone. I've read up about it, and there are many historians who really have done work to try to identify whether it's authentic or not. One is that the runes are not really the right runes. The other thing is that there are no other things around. You know, when you kind of established a big fact like the settlement on Newfoundland by the Vikings, it's not just one thing. You have to have a whole lot of corroborating archaeological evidence, you know, supporting this. So in the beginning, it comes out as a theory, and then as you know, historians work more on the topic, it becomes more as an established theory, and then historians then eventually agree that this is the way it is. So I think with this topic, that runestone, I think it's just a single item that some people believe is from the Vikings, other people believe it's not, and it's still very uncertain, I would say.
Thank you. Question here from Randall in the United States, and he asks, could you recommend a comprehensive English language history of Scandinavia?
Let me think about that. Yeah. English language. Yeah, I'll take a look. I'll ask Heather to take a note of your email so that I can forward something to you in a day or two when I've been able to look it up.
Wonderful, thank you, Knut. And then just finally for tonight, we've got lots of questions about this. If you could just tell us a little bit about the painting that's behind you.
Oh yes, wonderful. Yeah, I love that painting. It's an oil painting by a Montreal artist called Yehudi Shaki, who's still alive. He's in his 80s. He's been very prolific and paints these panels, which are very colorful, very many different colors, typically landscapes, as you see here. He's of Israeli Greek origin, so he paints often landscapes that he memorizes from his childhood, early days, I guess. This specific one, he said, was probably from Lebanon or somewhere around there. So that type of scenery. And he's still, if you are interested, look him up, Shaki, Chaki. I'm sure you'll find him, and there's a gallery here in Montreal that carries him. So good. I guess that's the last question. So I'll just say thank you very much for tuning in today. It's been a pleasure to give that lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you have a trip planned with Viking, maybe a river cruise or an ocean cruise. I'm going next week on Viking Venus to the British Isles and then into the Baltic. So I'm looking forward to that. Maybe I'll see you on board. And thank you very much and take good care. Bye for now.